Maybe you stayed logged in.
So, board members, we're on item 6, School Accountability Redesign Advisory Committee. Who will be speaking to us will be Assistant Superintendent of Student Learning, Darren Nielsen, and then Executive Director of Center for Assessment, Scott Marion. We're going to turn the time over to you. Again, this is a information item. I'm sure you want a presentation and then get questions at the end, Darren, so how do you want to do this? I'll turn the time over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. We're open to questions throughout. It might be easier to let us flow through and then get questions, but if any of the board members feel like they'll lose a question, if we move past it, certainly stop me. As we get started on this, just to remind everyone, it was about August or June of last year that the board directed staff utilizing, I believe, some ESSER 1 state admin money to organize this work around trying to provide suggestions and ideas around redesigning Utah's school accountability system. One thing I've learned working at the State Board of Education is improved patience. Things never move as fast. That was a long time ago, more than a year ago. We were scheduled to complete the work by September 30th of 2022. And we'll talk a little bit today in this meeting that we had our concluding executive committee meeting on October 31st. So that was clearly behind schedule. A number of reasons for that. So I apologize we weren't presenting this information to the board in October. But we're happy to be here today to give you this information. And I believe there's actually an action we're hoping for is that the board will receive the report. And the reason that's important to me as your staff is that signals to me I can conclude the groups and the work that we're doing on that. So let's go into a little bit of an overview. I think it's important for the public to understand as well, I think all of our board members do, that the Utah legislature has established and they maintain authority over the school board to adopt rules to implement that statewide accountability system. So when the public is considering who has the strings over school accountability, it's the Utah legislature that controls most of those. So the redesign process requires a partnership of shared leadership between the State Board of Education and the leadership. So that context, as we talk about these recommendations, both for the board and the public who might be listening or listen to this recording later, that's the context of these recommendations. So the charge at the beginning and the statement of work was to help to organize this work around redesigning Utah's school accountability system to be more aligned with the personalized competency-based learning and Utah's Portrait of a Graduate while maintaining an easy-to-compare, simple, transparent school accountability system, which is a really challenging task, or it would be found everywhere in the country. Nonetheless, it's worthwhile work. Two committees were established at the beginning of this work, an executive committee, and I want to acknowledge and offer my gratitude for those board members who were assigned to that. Board Member Hutchings, Board Member Hart, Board Member Lear, and Chair Huntsman. Thank you for your service on that, and there were a number of other members from the House and the Senate, from the Governor's Office, and other organizations that served on that executive committee. The advisory committee was made up of what sometimes is referred to as the Noah's Ark model, where we try to get 2 of every group to join. So primarily educators, but we did have parents that participated as well, and educators that represented different positions and perspectives. This list is the advisory committee names, and I want to pause for a moment to express my deep gratitude to them. There were 11 meetings held over the last year. When we invited them to join this committee, there were questions about what kind of time commitment. These folks all have professional jobs that require a lot from them, and they were willing to join in, and they provided what you'll see in their recommendations, I think very well thought out suggestions that I hope those who are in policy positions will consider those recommendations thoughtfully as they move forward. This represents each of these members of the committee who attended each event. It's about 50 hours total per person. If you times that for the full group, this report represents over 1,500 hours of work from this committee that you see here, and then staff who were engaged in helping to support their deliberation. The executive committee, we were able to meet early on because this committee is made up of policymakers who have significant demands on their time. This is one area that I was challenged with, trying to find opportunities for that group of people to get together. I think there were about 15 members of the executive committee, and that was one of our challenges of being able to move the work along on our time frame. It notes here we met on October 31st. The executive committee met on October 31st. At the end of that, we didn't have a quorum there, so we weren't in a position that the executive committee could take any action on the report. So the words that they unanimously supported was that we would provide to you information that the report the advisory committee created was provided to the executive committee. Again, our original intention would be the executive committee would also endorse the report, and we weren't able to get to that point through this process. And we've talked about the advisory committee. We also, I think it's important to note, not just for today, for this group, but for the public to understand, last spring we engaged the public in the process of informing the work of the advisory committee through a statewide survey where we received just under 5,000 responses that were made up almost half and half, teachers and parents. We also had administrators and other groups, but the large portion were teachers and parents. We held 4 stakeholder engagement events, one in Washington County in person, one at Murray School District in person, and 2 statewide remote. You'll see this information will be in the final report when it's published, so you can see the connections to the recommendations and that public input. I'm going to, with your permission, Chair, turn the next few slides over to Dr. Scott Marion, who was charged through the RFP process. Their company was selected to help us navigate the work of coming up with these recommendations through the advisory committee.
Before we go to Dr. Scott, and I sure appreciate him and a lot of patience that he's had through this whole process and continued patience today. This is an actionable item. It's changed on the agenda. I apologize, I wasn't totally updated on that. But it is actionable at the conclusion of this. So I apologize for that statement that I said earlier. So I'll turn this over to Dr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we'll cut to the chase. And I appreciated Board Member Earle's comments about the constraints of the federal accountability requirements. And this group was given the charge by the executive committee early on to be bold and to think outside the box on what we would want for an accountability to support the kind of things that Darren mentioned, personalized and competency-based learning and students' attainment of the portrait of a graduate characteristics and competencies. And so, but it's a tricky needle to thread because a lot of the other part of that was simple, transparent, comparable, and so doing both things at the same time is challenging. And so the way the committee wrestled this, I think in almost a Solomon-like way, is they said, we're going to have local indicators because that supports the agency of local education agencies, schools, parents, et cetera, to figure out the things that work best in their context to help improve their schools and to help improve their students' learning. And the other piece is this profile approach for reporting accountability results. And so we're going to talk about all these. If you want
me to drive?
Yeah, that's great. And so the local indicators piece, you know, we often do this. We say we want students to develop these self-regulatory skills and executive functioning and agency, but then we're going to tell teachers exactly what to do. It's like, well, that doesn't make sense. We have to be coherent. If we want to develop agency in students, we have to develop agency in teachers and principals and school leaders as well. And so the advisory committee felt pretty strongly about this, that they wanted a little bit of a loose tight here. So they weren't willing to say, just pick any local indicators you want. They did say, we think that they should be in these 3 classes of indicators: school climate, supporting learner agency, and portrait of a graduate. And I should also say that as part of the work of developing these systems, we work with people to develop, we call a theory of action, or some people call it a logic model, is because we could hope to improve student learning. But hope is not really a great theory of action. It's you really need to understand what's it going to take. If I want teachers to better understand score reports, that's going to require some professional development or better reporting. And so school climate and learner agency were key aspects of the driving indicators towards student learning of a portrait of a graduate. So this was reflected a nice balance of both the outcomes, portrait of a graduate, and the inputs, if you will, learner agency and school climate. Let's go to the next slide. The other thing, as Darren mentioned, most of the folks on the advisory committee worked in schools or districts or around schools or districts, so they understood, very well understood, as did many members of the executive committee, that people in schools are already burdened with a lot of day jobs, right? And so how could we capitalize on existing structures where they made sense, where they added value, but importantly added efficiency? And the two that we landed on was using the results of the school accreditation system, and we could talk more about that if folks want. But people are always wrestling with, well, just reading and math scores is not the only way to characterize school quality. So how do I characterize school quality more broadly? The school accreditation system does that quite well, and where we have it at the high schools, committee members thought that that could add value to this accountability system. And then the School Land Trust Program, as many of you know, is a pretty unique program in Utah. I work in a lot of Western states that derive money from public land leasing and things like that. I think Utah is the only one, at least among Wyoming, Montana, New Mexico, where I work regularly, that has this kind of program. We direct this money to local school councils to figure out how they should best support student learning and student growth at their institutions. And so if there's already a group charged with identifying needs at a school level to figure out what they want to measure and support, the advisory committee felt pretty strongly that the School Lands Trust Program was a good good program to sort of be married to this. And I don't know if you want to. You did a lot more background research on this one.
Yeah. You know, the School Lands Trust program in the state, as many of you know, and again, I'd like to highlight this for our public partners, is that there's a significant infrastructure that exists for that program. And when I use the term infrastructure, from a policy standpoint, from a technical standpoint, from a practice standpoint, each school has to have a community council. That council needs to be chaired by a parent. The majority of members, their members are elected to that council, and the majority has to be parent voices. They already review data from their school. They can include data from the statewide assessment system, or they could be looking at data from locally derived measurements. After identifying their greatest academic needs, they establish goals. Those goals then are submitted and provided to a local board of education for approval, then submitted to the State Board of Education, where your staff over School Lands Trust monitor to make sure that their proposed expenditures align with the approved purposes or uses. They implement their plans, and then they have to report out whether they achieved the goals the following year, and they provide that information in a public meeting. So we've heard, both in our stakeholder outreach and then broadly, just listening to public meetings, both in the board and across the Utah legislature in the last session, there is an interest in more public transparency and public involvement. This infrastructure that exists in the School Land Trust program seems to have an opportunity to do that without creating additional structures unnecessarily.
Thanks, Darren. And so what you see here, we separate, just like we do now, as high schools are different animals than elementary and middle schools, because they graduate kids, because they send kids off after high school to some sort of, whether it's college, career, military, et cetera. So there's different availability of indicators. The other thing at high schools is, and this came through in our stakeholder surveys, the most valued indicator among stakeholders was academic growth of students, right? How much is the school doing to help kids grow in their attainment of language arts and mathematics and science skills? And then, but at high school, you're running out of time to grow. You should be helping kids grow, but you need to actually help them attain. And so that's why we separate the two. On the left, at least on my left side, you see the state indicators look familiar with the addition of this leadership for learning that would be based largely on indicators we would derive from the accreditation system. We wouldn't just take the accreditation results as just a pass-fail. We would rely on the individual indicators and measures in there. And then on the right side, you see the school, the local indicators. And these we're going to talk about the valuing in a second. But it is important to point out, while I completely support, I think the only person here who's argued about the federal accountability system more than Board Member Earl is me. And so I'm on record doing that a lot. But the public does value, are kids learning to read? Are they learning to do math? Are they growing in that? And so that was important, and it's something we can look at across schools and districts or LEAs. And then at K-8, you see very much similar thing. It looks a lot like our current accountability system, but then with the addition of the local indicators. So people will say, well, how are these going to count together? We have a response for that. Let's go to the next. So the advisory committee, and it was not a secret, members of the advisory committee, I'll just put it bluntly, do not like school grades. They feel like they obscure more than help, and they feel like they drive people to just chase the grade as opposed to trying to figure out what's driving that grade and what's going on behind the scenes. And so they recommended using what we call a dashboard or profile approach, and where you display the results for all indicators in a very transparent, it is much more transparent. And the way the metaphor I use is consumer reports. If you're thinking about buying a car and you care more about acceleration than you do about reliability or gas mileage, or you care more about gas mileage, then you might actually go with one versus the other. So this is what a profile might look like for a high school. And you could see the only reason I put, I apologize if anybody's colorblind, where I put the local indicators in green is just to separate them off. But everything's on the same profile, and then and we have a common metric on the y-axis there. In this case, it's 0 to 4. People like to use 4 or 5-point rubrics. And we do that already with the current accountability system. We tend to translate things into a 1 to 4 scale or a 0 to 4 scale. So this would be familiar, and it's something we do. I heard one of the earlier speakers today talking about rubrics. It's very common in education. Let's go to the next. Oh, it's actually, let's go back for just 1 second on this. Sorry. So people will ask, and this came up in the executive committee meeting, as Board Member Hart remembers, is, well, how are we going to figure out which schools to serve if they need service, or which schools should get some other designation? This kind of system is already in place in at least 5 states right now. So you're not required by federal law or any other means to come up with some sort of total score and school grade. And it's quite simple, right? If you looked at this and a school had all 1s across the board, you don't need to do a lot more thinking to say they probably need some support, right? That's the easy case. All 4s, you could probably say, let's just stay out of their way. And then that's where the decisions and the values start coming in. What do you value more? And we've done this, like I said, in at least a handful of states where it's the real advantage there. If you're a school person and let's say we figured out that the lowest 5% is a score of 112, 112, or something like that, and they could just look at their results and say, yeah, I think we're going to be identified this year. They don't have to, try to do a Rube Goldberg formula to figure it out. And so it works on both sides. For the public, I'm parent, oh, now my youngest is in college, but as a parent of a high school kid, like, are they preparing my kids to go to, somewhere beyond high school, post-secondary? Are they doing a good job? I care a lot about that. That's the indicator I'm really going to value. And they're also doing really well on portrait of the graduate. Those are things I really value. Yeah, they're not doing as well on academic growth, but it's a high school, and maybe I'm okay with that. So that's how individuals could weigh in. I don't know if you want to go to the policy recommendations now.
Yeah, let's do.
Yeah. So all of this, all the policy recommendations, not all of them, but a lot of them, especially in the class of accountability, the indicators, school performance levels, calculation of points, it all stems from this, whether there's a total score and a school grade or not. And really, it all comes down to that simple decision. If, in fact, the legislature is willing to let go of the school grade or the total score, then you have to follow that. It's a cascading effect through various policies, whether how we define performance levels, how we calculate overall points, because as you know, even the calculation of points is specified in legislation. And so all that would need to change. The same thing on the definitions of school improvement and identification. Like I said, there's lots of ways to do this effectively, but when the law requires you to identify based on a particular grade or a certain set of points, then all that has to be unwound.
I think that's it.
Yeah. And so you see the next steps. We certainly welcome and invite the board's comments and reactions. And so you have an uploaded report, since we had it last executive committee meeting on the 31st. We anticipated that we would get some comments today, maybe one or two. And so as soon as we take your comments and produce the final, we'll make it pretty like we did with the assessment report and things like that. So you have a publication-ready report for the website and for distribution.
Vice Chair Belknap?
Yeah, I have a question on accreditation, because Cognia, when they accreditate, I'm not sure that's such a word, but I just created it. I like accredited. Anyway, I apologize. That they give accreditation to these schools. Some of them are on provisional accreditation for years. They never get out of provisional. So why is that going to be one of our major metrics when some of these schools work so hard and they get a great score in accreditation and others are on provisional year after year after year?
Yeah, I can address that. At least some of the discussion that the committee had. While the word provisional wasn't brought up by the advisory committee, there was discussion about what if my school's accreditation score isn't as high as I would like it to be now that it's going to be factored into school accountability. And would we need to wait the 3 or 5 years until we are reaccredited to have our score adjusted if we could increase it or change our performance? And there's strong recommendation from the advisory committee that schools would be allowed to have that score updated when they are able to demonstrate through that process that they've made the appropriate improvements and changes. So I think there's a hope from the advisory committee that by elevating the status of accreditation, I mean, ideally you would, at least I would assume that accreditation in your school accountability system should be coherent and they should have similar outcomes, even though the criteria that they're being used is a little bit different. They both should be focused on helping the school in a cycle of continuous improvement. And the advisory committee, part of their message was elevating this into certain components of this into the accountability system could actually bring about more meaningful change through that process that already exists. The accreditation discussion evolved from, this was fascinating to listen to the group do this. They started talking about, well, really to understand what makes a school good, somebody needs to go there and visit the school. And then it went to, well, if you're going to visit school, there probably should be a few people. You should interview people. You should examine their outcomes. And then the discussion is like, hey, that's what accreditation does. And that's the root of the discussion that led to this part of the recommendation is we already have this process that we would like to do anyway for some people would like to do for accountability, but it's so cost prohibitive and it would bring in this additional burden because they started saying, well, how many staff would that take at the State Board of Education to do that? I'm like, well, let's not talk about I actually said, let's not talk about that. And that's what brought us back around, or this group back around to the leveraging, the accreditation process of getting a closer look. There were a couple of indicators that the community really felt strongly in. One of those was effective teaching and leading. I think was rated 2 or 3 when we did the survey as the most important indicators. We don't have very good proxy indicators to be able to show the public how effective is instruction and leadership in that school. The accreditation takes a close look at that, and they have some indicator scores related to those outcomes in the secondary school setting.
I appreciate that, Darren. One more, Chair. I just really struggle. We have 2 places in the state of Utah that are credited to give credit to our students, which one is Sullivan Learning in St. George, and another one is Northwest Packet Company. And it's not really called that, but that's what they do. But it's true. They give packets to kids, but they're accredited. And so I would also question, is the accreditation really valid? In that, I just want you to consider that thought. And that's all. Thank you.
Just one response, if I may,
Yes.
Mr. Chair. So the other thing, Vice Chair, is you said it's a major part of the system. We don't know that it's a major part yet. It's part of the system, but when we would bring together, let's say, a deliberative body to figure out how to establish these decisions based on the profile, they might say, accreditation is valuable, but it's not as valuable as these other things, and it would get treated that appropriately that way.
Member Klein?
Yeah, so I have a lot of questions, probably more than you want right now. So I would hope that we could maybe postpone this until we can have all of our questions fleshed out, as this is basically a complete overhaul of everything we do in education and should not just be jumped into quickly and without much consideration. I know that staff has been working on this for a long time, but this is, we have not been involved in that process. And so this is a lot of information to take on in a very short amount of time. So first off, it appears that we're recommending going to a completely different grading system that is arguably more transparent. I would say less transparent, and schools that are using the standardized, the number system for grading now, the parents have been very unhappy with it, and so many of the students as well, because they don't know where they're at. It's taken something that has historically been very objective and made it subjective. As far as, what does a 1 mean? What does a 2 mean? What does a 3 mean? And a 4, and the way it's calculated throughout the year, and how you don't know where you are until the end of pretty much till the end of the year. But now we're adding in these subjective measurements. You say we don't want kids chasing after grades. So now we want to figure out kids' internal motivations. And what motivates, so we're scoring them on what motivates them to learn instead of actual learning, which puts us in a really strange space for trying to change their motivations or elicit certain motivations from them when the school's job is just to teach and assess. So that leads to my next question. If you have all of these subjective indicators, or that are now part of the child's profile instead of grade, their profile, how do you assess those subjective areas? What do those assessments look like? Who's making those assessments? Who's coming up with the questions? How do we know there's not some kind of bias inserted into those questions? Because obviously, if there's going to be somebody's bias if it's something subjective about their attitudes, their values, their beliefs, their motivations for why they are doing, why they respond the way they do. Are these questions going to be part of a high stakes test like the RISE assessment? And if not, but it's now required for their grade, are these surveys that ask them for the more subjective answers from kids in these more subjective areas, are they going to be required now instead of optional? Because right now surveys are opt-in, and we're having a massive revolt around the state right now about these surveys and their intrusive questions on children's mindsets.
So, Member
we're-
Klein, I'm trying to keep track of your questions.
Okay.
You've been
So
asking
I'm
several along the
my
way. and so
concerns,
I'm hoping they
expressing
can
my concerns
answer.
along the way, but, and maybe I'll stop there, but for now, and
But they
maybe
can
I'll
answer
come
some
back.
of those questions
But yes,
if you
please
want.
go ahead.
But then I also remind you that what this work isn't the end game. This is just the work of one committee
Okay.
that goes to the state board for consideration as the accountability system, or as you're moving into a different accountability system, that the board, the group here, can accept, reject, whatever happens out of this committee. This is not the end game. It's eventually this committee's going to stop, and they've done their work. Tell me, am I speaking this incorrectly?
Yeah, and that's my hope today.
But
is
then
that
I want you
just
to get into our questions.
Yeah, that you receive the report, which just signals to me, I terminate the work with the committee, and we provide the report, and the board and the legislature clearly has the authority to do with it what they would like.
So
Yeah, I just wanted to
clarification,
make sure it's in the right context.
yeah, I just wanted, so to clarify, by voting to receive the report that the committee has done. Is that what you just said?
Yes.
And then we look at it and make changes to it if we want,
Whatever-
or
whatever you
accept it
want
the
to.
way it is. And if we don't receive it, then the committee continues?
We're-
Well,
Yeah.
I would need direction at that point.
It's ready to conclude. And so you're in receive, and then what you have is a report from, and that the board can do whatever they want. They can put it on the shelf, let it collect dust, or as you are dealing in the accountability space in the future, you can refer to the work of the committee, but that doesn't mean it has to be your work as a board. So and that was really clear in the very beginning as it was being rolled out in putting this group together and trying to stay in the scope. The scope of the work, the concluding part of this is to submit their work to the board, and then the board does with it what they choose. So, but you did have some questions.
Yeah, so
in
I
there. So I
think-
just wanted to make sure
Yeah.
that the context and everything that this committee was doing in that scope concludes not with the end game for the state, but a report for the board's future consideration. I know we have other questions.
Yeah,
Did
so
you
I'll
wanna
try to be
respond?
brief. Board Member Klein, so I'm not exactly clear about the subjectivity, although as someone who studies this stuff closely, I think everything's subjective. I don't think there's any objective. I don't want to disabuse anyone because somebody's picking the questions that go on a math test and somebody's picking the questions, the reading passages. So there's always a degree of subjectivity. We try to here's a $2 word, come up with intersubjective agreement so that we have shared understandings of what these things mean. So the system is still largely based on math scores, reading scores, graduation rate, post-secondary readiness, things like that. I think if I'm right, you might be talking about portrait of a graduate indicators. And those are things like critical thinking, effective communication, civic awareness, et cetera. And there are ways, and this is what we talk about in the report, it would be really hard for every LEA and school to go invent ways to figure out how to see where kids are at in this and figure out how to best instruct them in these areas. So the state already has a massive initiative of trying to help schools and LEAs figure out how to do this work better. But we would like to see some shared approaches to what are some really good approaches to measuring critical thinking? It doesn't involve opinions. It's an assessment that if we got 10 people in the room and when we looked at a range of papers, we could say, this paper really demonstrates high levels of critical thinking. This one really seems to be missing. There's no feelings involved in that, right? It's just what we think is, and people have to then specify what they mean by critical thinking in the first place and define these terms. So I'm of the belief that as long as we can come up with an operational definition of any of these kinds of things, we could figure out a way to assess it and try to assess it as fairly as possible. And there's always ways to check that. Because if I brought together a different group, then, and they said that, I completely disagree, then I know I have a problem. And that's the kind of validity checks that we do all the time. Is that, but I might have missed the whole subjective part, so.
It's this idea of how we can, this is psychoanalyzing kids instead of just scoring them on the work that they do. And that there's a really interesting paper that I would recommend to other board members to read. It's by the American Enterprise Institute, called Asking the Right Questions About Using Non-Academic Indicators for School Accountability. And I don't know if you're familiar with this paper. It talks about, what is it, NAMES, the National
Academy for Science.
Yes, so I know that was mentioned in your report, that group, and you reference some of the same things that this article references, but it tells a lot of the motivation behind these accountability redesigns. This is actually by someone that's for the redesign, but they're very open about what the motivations are behind the accountability redesign. For instance, I mean, there's a lot of interesting things in here, but it says traditional accountability purposes might involve attaching rewards or sanctions to performance on indicators as a way of signaling priorities and motivating actors to change their behaviors. But measures in accountability systems might also inform decisions about resource allocation, influence public support for the local school system, or identify students who need extra instruction. Some mandated consequences for poor performance under ESSA, for instance, are explicitly focused on identifying schools that could benefit from supports, even if they also create a perception of shaming those same schools. And there's a lot of, it mentions, some trends mention they could lead to greater emphasis on non-academic indicators for accountability purposes and how to incorporate those even possibly into high-stakes testing. So this idea of trying to change behaviors or attitudes or values through including these kind of scores in a student's profile is something I find highly problematic and is not the role of schools.
Yeah, I'll just be very quick. I'll just say that the advisory committee, who, like Darren said, was a stellar, dedicated group, wrestled with exactly those kinds of things. How do you, what kind of are the right motivations? What are the sanctions, rewards, continuous improvement? And that's what led to the theory of action, the design principles. I don't think there was the desire by us, I don't know everybody's hearts and minds, but as far as it was obvious to any of us, it was any desire to change anybody's values and the way they think about themselves. It was about how do we provide the best opportunities for kids to be successful in the future. I never heard one person mention values or anything like that.
Questions or comments? Oh, we're going to go to some other questions and comments from board members, and we'll just try to limit it to one, and we'll just keep kind of going around. Again, this is just a report, so if you have a question about the report, this is a time to ask, but if you don't like it, don't act on it. But Member Earl, you're next, sorry.
Yeah, just a couple of
Then Hart, you're on deck.
Just a couple of comments. I do have concerns too about the, the unknowns or the three areas. And that leaves it up to some speculation. We are seeing some organizations like Panorama and such that are trying to delve into this area and becoming highly specialized in the gathering of individual data on students. So there is legitimate concern out there in some of these ed tech companies that are attempting to do whether that was the intent of this committee or not. So I think it is something to be cautious of and be aware of. Those are things that I've voiced before. But the only other thing I have a concern with is we do know, and it's as you stated, that those academic things are really where parents want. I mean, that's why we do what we do. Parents want those. They want to know that their kids can read. They want to know that they can be successful in the academic setting. We do know that culture in a school breeds high efficiency in those areas, right? But there is a caution as to what type of culture we're measuring. And so that's where I think, for me, that gets a little concerning. Are we measuring academic culture, or are we just measuring this idea of belonging to a school, which has taken on whole nuances in the last couple of years, a whole different nuance from, I think, what people, and maybe what some of the solid research has had out there. So I guess for me, I have a strong preference for that academic success, but those also naturally incorporate in components of the portrait of a graduate. A high academic culture is collaborative, it is creative, it is those things. And to me, I wish we could go back to the portrait of a graduate and actually create some kind of a hierarchy, or so that it's not all of these are of equal value. There's some that I think are valued more and actually are a natural build onto the final result that we want. There's ins and out pieces here. I don't know if this forces all districts to have to do competency-based education models. It feels a little bit like that. And that's the element that I'm a little concerned with, because I've seen some unsuccessful models where parents are like, my kids really are not being taught. It feels a little bit more, in the homeschool culture, it's a little bit more like unschooling. And some people that's successful for, but a lot of people it may not create the outcomes that we want. So anyways, those are just my thoughts. I do appreciate all the hard work. I've been to a number of meetings and been able to listen in. There's been thoughtful dialogue. I just, I think I don't like the grading system. Some measurement systems like this, I think are, as long as we're careful how we do it, are better. I appreciate the thoughtfulness of that. And there was one more comment I had. I might have to come back to it. That's it. There is one more comment, but I can't think of what it was. Oh, I know what it was. It was, I think there is some thoughtful process in not duplicating things we're already doing. So if we're getting accreditation right, then let's not duplicate that. But we need to make sure we're getting accreditation right, and that we're not allowing accreditation to get hijacked with other type of things. And that's, and that would be my concern, is that if we're already doing it, then let's use what we're already doing. Let's don't add more complication to our system. And I think some of the dialogue around that has been valuable, so.
So there wasn't a question in there, so thank you, but so hang on, we're not going into a debate here. If we have some questions on it, but I'm going to go to Member Hart.
Yes. So in reading and preparing for the board meeting, I noticed that the recommended action was that we receive the report. It's not anything further than that. So I would like to make a motion that the board receive the school accountability redesign report.
We have a motion and a second.
Can I speak to that, please?
And do you want to speak to the
Yes,
motion?
please. So first of all, we have to be really careful that accountability doesn't get mixed up with assessment. Accountability, in my mind, includes transparency and having information available. The issue about accreditation is that it's just a one-stop shop. But I just wanted to add that. I understand this isn't a debate. I just wanted to kind of close that loop. Clearly, this warrants further conversation, but I don't think that receiving the report does anything besides releasing the committee from their charge, which I feel like they did very well. They've given us a lot of information and a lot of very, very strong information, very reliable information. I was so struck by the professionalism of the committee and how many different people, I think I knew 11 of the members in various ways, and that was just an amazing alchemy of expertise in our state. So hats off to you for putting together a really awesome group. I think that we also need to note, I don't think we need to forget, and we need to keep in the forefront of our mind, how difficult it's going to be when we start talking competency-based. These same things are going to come up in every area in which we try to transition to competency-based. I think we need to really be careful. I think it's going to take a lot more time and a lot more effort and a lot more education than we think it will. And I think just even this little discussion shows that. So in the spirit of simply releasing that committee and then having a report that we can use to help make wise decisions moving forward, that's why I would like to, that's why I made the motion.
Thank you. We're speaking to the motion. Member Hanson?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I'll speak in favor of the motion. I think that the committee has done their work. I think that they've presented a lot of good ideas, and it gives the board food for thought and the ability to move forward and do the work that we need to do. I just thought about kind of the breadth and depth of the task that we gave this committee. Thinking about, we're talking about what is the purpose of education? And we go around this room and through our audience, and you'll get different answers from everyone about that. You know, what are the measurables? How can they be weighted properly? Those are big questions that we still have to struggle with going forward. And you can see with the back and forth that's gone from the legislature to the dashboard that was developed and then redeveloped, and over the past several years, we've been dealing with that. So I don't think the task is done, but we have a framework now that we can work within. I really like the idea of having comparables, so standard measurements that we can look at, like consumer reports across the state, and then maybe compare to other states and see how we're doing. Because part of this accountability is to see, are we doing the job we should with our kids in the state? So that is something that's important to me. I think there should be a total score on the mandatory indicators so that we could easily compare school to school. And then there might be some more flexible indicators that we can't score so easily that parents could use or other people could use to see if a school is focusing on other areas. I think the idea of using accreditation is a good one. I think that's the deep look that we get in our schools. I wonder if there's something we can do in the future with accreditation to make it more efficient, because 3 to 5 years that's a long time between snapshots. I wonder if there's a way we could look at accreditation and say, can this be more of a continuous improvement type process, or we can check in with accreditors and bump scores up, or accreditors could look if things are going the wrong way and reduce scores even. We should be able to do that in today's world with the availability of data and maybe periodic visits by accreditors to make that more efficient. I wondered, getting to my questions, I guess, if I can ask questions, I wondered about discussion on the ACT. We have all juniors take the ACT in the state. I saw there was a mention that might be included, but wondered why that isn't a mandatory, or wasn't recommended as a mandatory the same way that our statewide assessment tests are. So that's one question for the group.
Yeah, I think.
Please respond.
I think I can respond to that. I don't recall the committee recommending it not be pulled out. It falls under that post-secondary readiness umbrella. So there wasn't discussion about removing the ACT. There was discussion about whether the ACT's relevance will maintain over time. As you know, through the pandemic, immediately following that, many universities stopped requiring the ACT or SAT. There's been some changes back, some subtle changes back towards that. So the committee did discuss that, about whether that tool or instrument would lose some of its relevance, but there wasn't a recommendation to remove it. It would maintain under the post-secondary readiness indicator that currently exists.
Okay, thank you. That clarifies that for me. The other thing, when we talk about school climate, and we've had a lot of discussions about the SHARP survey, was that an item of discussion at all? Because that's kind of a standard test that has been widely, used in the state.
Yeah, the SHARP survey was not mentioned. What was debated or discussed, actually would be a better term, was there is the school climate survey that the State Board of Education makes available for schools, districts and schools to use. And then some LEAs have created their own. You'll see here the recommendation is that the school climate metric, whatever measurement tool that is, whether it's a survey or something else, that it would be a locally determined indicator. So it falls into that green side where it'd be a local decision about how they measure school climate.
So no discussion about a more generalized indicator, something like the SHARP survey where standard questions are asked across the state?
Yeah, so SHARP survey was not discussed. That survey particularly was not discussed by the committee as being something they would want to include, but the school climate survey that the state board has begun administering 2 years ago, I think, that was discussed of whether you would require that instrument or allow local districts to have their own. And you'll see the recommendation from that committee was to allow it to be a locally identified indicator.
Okay.
Yeah, the state providing resources to help with it.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll stop the inquiry there. I think we've got a lot of work to do. I just appreciate the foundation that's been laid by the committee, so thanks for the good work that was done.
Okay, thank you. We have a few more lights on for questions or comments to the motion. Member Booth.
Well, I feel certainly supportive of receiving this report and commending the committee for their thoughtful and innovative work. I feel very positive about the future. I'm not worried that we can't find solutions for our children's future education. What are we preparing our students for? Now, that's the unknown, and it's constantly changing. And as you spend any time with people in the workforce, they're trying to figure it out too. It's so different in even the last 2 or 3 years. And so we have to keep our eyes open, but I'm very positive about, I'm wide open and excited about new ideas. And I compliment the committees that have been involved in this report, that they were willing to entertain and explore new ideas, the new ideas on local indicators. I feel the report is of great value, and I'm eager to dive into it with into their careful work and their recommendations as the board now gets to work hard to discover what should we do with this very important body of information that's been provided for us. So I'm grateful and want to just say thank you. Yes, I'll definitely vote to receive it and hopefully commend the committee for the thoughtful and innovative work they've done. Thank you.
Member Cannon.
Yes, I too am in favor of this report. I think there was some great thinking that went into it. I loved reading about presenting some of these factors, the way they would be presented in a consumer reports, because I use consumer reports all the time, and I know which factors are exactly important to me and what I'm looking for. I do have one question. I would like to see accreditation really be meaningful and active, and I believe that all of our public schools are required to be accredited. My question is, are all charter schools also required to be accredited?
Darren.
Yeah, so let me make sure I clarify. When we talk about, my answer is going to be narrowed in on grades 9 through 12. So schools that have grades 9 through 12, any public school, including charter schools, do require accreditation. One of the caveats with accreditation, there's an allowable of an LEA level accreditation in those cases, and that happens in our state in a few instances and maybe more in the future. They accredit it, even the elementary and middle schools, but they do it at a district-wide or LEA-wide level. So there's certainly some challenges, because even within a a high school in one district, they're getting an LEA level accreditation report, and in another district, they might be getting an individual school accreditation report. So there's challenges within that recommendation. But yes.
Okay, and what about charters?
Yes, charter schools that offer grades 9 through 12 would need to be accredited.
Okay, thank you.
Member Straight?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I appreciate the work of the advisory committee. I appreciate the diversity and the thoroughness of their discussion. You know, I'm thankful that as a board member, I don't have to research out every single element, that we have now a starting point. And that starting point is, if I'm climbing a ladder, I feel like I'm on step 5 of an 8-step ladder. So this is really helpful information. You know, I remember when school accountability first started, and there was some fear and trepidation behind that as an educator. And over time, I have witnessed improvements made. Just a simple thing of putting more weight behind growth instead of just proficiency. That was a change that greatly impacted my feelings towards accountability. The data is the data. It's information that we can use. If we're not using it productively, then maybe we need to reevaluate. But the truth of the matter is there's going to be continued improvement. There's going to be sometime down the road, there'll be another committee put together, and they will come up with recommendations, and they will look at where we're at currently, and let's just keep moving forward. So I appreciate the work of the committee, and I want to thank them publicly. Thank you.
Member Lear?
Thank you. I had 3 points. First of all, I was supposed to be a member of this committee. I was kind of a slacker member. I didn't attend as often as I probably could have or should have. I felt, though, after listening for a couple of times, that every one of these people on the committee had a lot more practical and current information and expertise than I did, and I felt like I was very well represented by the committee. Having said that, kind of excusing myself, that leads me to my next point, and that is that I feel a little like this discussion from some of the members is the way we praise teachers. You know, they're so wonderful. We learned in COVID how wonderful teachers are, but, and then it follows with some kind of horrible story or correction. I feel like this committee was the board's committee, and I don't like the practice of establishing a board committee and then saying, oh, but we'll disavow this committee. This is not really what I wanted to find, so we're not going to support the findings of this committee. I think that's a really dangerous practice, extrapolating it even beyond this committee. I don't like that idea. If we're going to support choosing a committee and then let these people spend 11 meetings times 3+ hours, we should, as a board, support our committee and not then reject it because we don't necessarily like the outcome. That was the second point. And I will rely on this committee. I will rely on the expertise of these people because it's a broad spectrum and they work together to move toward compromise. I heard enough. I saw that in the report. The last point I wanted to is more of a question, and I'm asking for your opinion, Darren, maybe Dr. Marion. I've heard, and I heard this sort of come up through the report discussions, or in the committee discussions, not report, that there was a definite feeling and positive motion toward a dashboard approach, and that we need to look at various other indicators, very much away from the school grading, which the legislature actually repealed. So my question is, I hope, and maybe it's going to be expressed in a hope, but I hope that this committee's direction will prevail. And is your sense, though, that despite this committee, that there's still an insistence by the legislators that were on this committee and others that it will be all for naught and they'll go back to a letter grade?
Please.
Yeah,
answer
that's
there.
a hard question.
I'm putting you on the spot a bit, but
Hard question to answer. mainly because the executive committee discussions on Monday, particularly when we presented this report, there wasn't a lot of dialogue about, there were some questions about the recommendations, but there wasn't a lot of dialogue about it. And we were missing a significant number of, the executive committee. I'll tell you this, this year, on October 11th, the board released the school report cards, which included an overall grade for the first time since, I think, 2018, maybe 17. The last time the accountability system was modified or improved, as Board Member Straight talked about, there was changes made then because of some of our challenges in 19 and the pandemic. It's just worked out that this is the first time the overall school grade's been issued under that 2017 legislation to make changes to school accountability. And I have the privilege of representing the board with many media outlets from time to time about topics like school grades or assessment. And that was certainly not different on the 11th. I had many media outlets call me and talk to me. And it was interesting and noteworthy that not one of those media outlets wanted to talk to me about school grades. Not one of their questions about how our students are performing. What can we learn from this year's results versus pre-pandemic and through the pandemic? Not one of those questions could be answered by simply referencing a school grade. And that caught my attention. I don't know whether that means that there are people in positions of power that feel the same way. We know I've worked for the board since 2017, and there's been legislation run to eliminate the school grade. I think this board has supported that each time it's come before the board. And then I believe it's moved through the House of Representatives every year, maybe unanimously one year.
I thought it actually passed. Am I,
No.
is that wishful thinking? Is that
Yeah,
what happened
yeah.
in my dreams?
The pandemic, we were able to, the legislature suspended school accountability.
Maybe, okay.
And anyway, so I don't know,
I
board member.
stand corrected on that.
I don't know, Board Member Lear, where the people who will be making those decisions stands. But the committee, you're right, the executive committee, or the advisory committee, again, looked at it like, I don't know that that adds value to the things we're trying to do. But there's the debate about transparency and what Board Member Hanson talked about earlier, having something that's kind of simple to just look at quickly and make some judgments about the other end of that, continuum of argument.
But your answer to me is you don't know.
I don't know.
It's not helpful,
I
Darren.
know.
Question.
If I may, just quickly. When we were helping this board, establish the performance levels on the current accountability system, we went through this exercise called standard setting, where you actually have to write descriptors of what an A means, what a B means. And it was, some of you were here then, but not all of you. And I asked the board to write down on their own what an A school is. And then we compared it. And people were fairly aligned. Once we got to a B school, there was no agreement. C school, forget about. And so we think we know what these things mean. And so that's why what Darren said, and Board Member Cannon, another Consumer Report advocate, is if I know what I care about in terms of academic growth or post-secondary readiness, I could go there. And so that's, but like Darren said, there's different people with different views, and that's why it becomes interesting, I think.
Thank you.
Member Hymas?
Thank you. With this accountability redesign, are we forcing schools to adopt PCBL? And if the answer is no, how are we supporting the schools that do not? Because this report is clearly on that. And I get the difference between receiving a report and maybe I'm jumping the gun here, but how are we supporting the schools that do not go there? If Utah is taking this route, how are we supporting those schools who say, I like this traditional method? There are several schools throughout the state that are successful where they are now. And so to change everything on them, what does that look like? Again, I guess the main question, how are we supporting the schools who do not want to go into this model?
Darren?
Let me try to answer a part of it. You'll see on this this model, example, descriptor, learner agency, and the report contains a lot more detail about learner agency. That would be an element that I think Board Member Hymas, you're referring to as the PCBL practices, right, that schools may or may not move forward with. You'll also see that it's under the committee's recommending it be under the local indicator, which gives them more autonomy. Again, the devil's in the details around what does, if this goes forward in some kind of policy change, what does that language look like? And again, so it's hard to answer whether this would go forward that way. The advisory committee didn't grapple with the concept of whether state schools would move forward with these instructional practices that are aligned with or associated with a personalized concept-based learning or not. So I don't know, I can't speak for their position on that opinion, but you'll see that it was very intentional that it would be under the locally identified indicator, something that they would have, by the advisory committee's perspective, have more autonomy to decide what does that look like? What do those instructional practices look like that we want to have scored in an accountability system? To the second part about resources, you'll see towards the bottom of the report, the advisory committee references a bunch of types of supports or on-ramping, things that would need to be considered. They didn't grapple with that because of the amount of time it would take to really get into those weeds and not knowing if their recommendations would go forward in a meaningful way. But clearly they made a nod at the end of that report that there's a lot of stuff that would need to happen. Like these things, in Utah, you couldn't turn the switch on and have this system working this spring or next spring.
Just one quick addition. The board and some of the, the advisory committee's leadership really focused on portrait of a graduate. And that's a board-adopted set of characteristics that they think are valuable for Utah kids to leave school with. And it's the outcome. So I agree with Board Member Earl that there's a lot of ways to get there, and sometimes infusing it in real courses and asking for critical thinking and collaboration is the way to do it. So we stayed out of that you must be PCBL. It was, we want kids to have this broad range of outcomes that are going to let them be successful. That's the focus, is the outcomes.
Okay, board members, I'm not seeing any other comments. We're going to put this to a vote. Again, we have a motion on the table. We've had some good discussion on it. And the motion before the board is that the board receive the School Accountability Redesign Report. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you. And again, I appreciate your patience with some of us through this process. So we've got to figure out, we need to give a shout out. I'll get with you guys, figure out how we make sure we get the thank yous pushed down to the end of the roll on.
We will. I'll send them an email today, but if you see any of them, thank them.
Okay, thank
they
you.
worked their tails off. Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
So when does this come back to us? We received it, so now what? Board leadership will decide how that's, I'm just wondering, what's the next process?
Once you receive it, anything and everything that you have moving forward and anything that you choose to do in this space, you have access to this report. So I imagine this report will come out in committees and anything that we choose to do, you choose to do as a board. Moving forward, you can reference this report. Now, and I said, well, it could go on a shelf and collect dust. I hope it doesn't with all of the work that was done in this, but now you have a report. Their work is done. You have this report from this committee. And of course, accountability is something that we've been experiencing for a long time, and there's tweaks and changes to that, and we have an opportunity to participate on that at the will of the board. So that's what happens to it. So it's used for a reference. You as board members as this moves forward. Does that answer your question, Member Hutchins?
I actually thought maybe I could add to that as a member of the executive committee. Part of our discussion on Monday was that Senator Milner, who was the senator present, and Representative Pulsiver, who was the representative present, they would each go and talk to the group of senators and group of representatives that were also assigned to the committee to get their
But if the report doesn't
consensus and move
change
forward.
or
Yeah.
anything, then it stays the way that it is. So
Yeah.
there's there's still a possibility of something else coming from the legislative side. Yes.
Okay, so then I guess my question is, we received it, but it doesn't necessarily mean we're in favor with all the contents of it, right? So
There's
that's
no
what
one
I
spoke-
I
the-
just want to,
The
yeah.
vote was not to, in favor or
And that's what I
support.
understood, but if we're referencing, so, okay, just making sure that's clear.
Yeah, now it's ours. Okay. Next up, Deputy Superintendent Stallings. We have our program analyst, Greg, is with us, so,
Yes.
wow,
good-
our morning went fast.
Yes, it did. Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me okay? There we go.
Okay, this is kind of a standing item as
Yes.
we keep moving forward, so.
Thank you, board members. Angie Stallings, Deputy Superintendent of Policy. Happy to be here with you today. And you'll notice I have Greg Cannell here with me today in lieu of Jeff Van Holten. We wanted you to be able to see, I'm sure many of you have met him, but he is, as Chair Huntsman stated, he's our policy analyst, and he is the one who helps orchestrate the policy requests from behind the scenes. And so we only have one request today that the staff put forward. Some of you may have been listening to the October Public Education Appropriations Subcommittee, where there was a report on the Special Needs Opportunity Scholarship Program. Something we found, it's a fairly new program. There are some problems with the current deadlines for the audits to be prepared, and then also the deadline for carry forward fund that exceeds the 40% to be remitted to the state treasurer. So staff are recommending that those deadlines related to the audits and the remittance of funds be changed in statute. That's essentially a summary of the policy request.
Questions? Oh, sorry, didn't see the light on. Vice Chair Davis.
I just, in the interest of time, I'm going to make the motion that the board directs staff to implement this is the wrong one, to work with legislators on potential amendments to Utah Code as proposed.
Motion and a second. Do you want to speak to the motion? Seeing none, I didn't write that down, but is it?
It's on the screen.
What was it again? Oh, is this one right here? Oh, that the board directs staff, okay, got it. That the board directs staff to work with legislators on potential amendments to Utah Code as proposed. Not seeing any discussion. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Voting is unanimous. Thank you. There's one, oh, we're not done. Member Straight.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I have a motion. I move that the board direct staff to work with the legislator or on potential legislation to amend provisions in section 53F-7-203 related to paid professional hours, including to, 1, amend the language to require the educator's plan to be submitted within the first 5 days of instruction instead of the first day of instruction. 2, explicitly allow educators to begin employment with an LEA after the beginning of a school year to submit the educator's plan within 10 days of employment. And 3, allow an LEA to prorate the hours provided to an educator who begins employment with the LEA after the beginning of the school year.
Okay, do we have a second? Second. Member Straight, you want to speak to your motion?
Yes, just briefly. This is, I'll use your words, just a betterment to more clearly define some situations of where LEAs had interpreted the use of those monies for like new hires and things like that. So we think this would be an improvement. So that's why I made the motion. Thank you.
Thank you. We're speaking to the motion. Vice Chair Davis?
I don't even know if this is feasible, but is this understood to be retroactive for this school year? This would apply to this school year, or this would be for the coming if they allot it in the future?
The coming.
So it wouldn't apply to those that turned their paperwork in on the second day of school this year and got turned down.
Deputy Superintendent Stallings, can you speak to how that all plays out? I know your
Yes.
answer, but we should hear it.
I could speak to that. It would, if we requested it to apply to this year, it would have to have an immediate effective date in the bill. Normally, bills have an effective date of around May 4th, May 5th each year. And so if we wanted it to apply to this year, there is a possibility. So if that is the desire of the board, if you want to indicate that, we could see what could be done with the bill drafters and when the bill takes effect. I mean, the earliest it would likely take effect would be sometime in February. It would require a 2/3 vote of both the House and Senate, and then the signature of the governor. So an immediate effective date happens right when the governor signs it. So there's a couple of things that would have to go into place. But there are options to have at least maybe 2 and 3 take place or impact this
You
current
want to
year.
follow up?
Yeah, I don't know if I need to make an amendment or what, but I would, okay, a lot of people didn't get their stuff in on the first day, and it's a brand-new thing, and then some principals in some districts were giving it still anyway, and some weren't because it's in the law that it has to be the first day. So I can see the wheels turning in Deputy Superintendent Jones's head, so he may need to give us some advice on this. But if, I would say this year, if we could make it for this school year, that would be preferable.
Member Straight?
If I may suggest, I would like to keep the original motion and not amend it. That would be my, but let's discuss that, and we can bring it back next
We can
board
explore.
meeting.
That's going to be my recommendation, keep the motion in place, and if there is an opportunity, come back and we'll bring it to the public body for on our legislative statutory changes. So that'd be my recommendation. Member Earl, your light's on?
Yeah, this is maybe a procedural question, but where we didn't have this one publicly available, is there a problem with this motion or not? We could just make a motion in this area?
No, because the
so-
end game, there's still not all this is for our body to start acting, and then whatever happens with 53F-7-203 comes back to us for support. So we still have more
Well,
opportunities.
it's not that, it's just that it's not publicly available anywhere. And this is the first time I've seen it, which is, I guess if it were relevant, but that's what I'm just asking the question. I'm not saying I disagree with
Angie?
the provisions.
Yes, thank you. The Open and Public Meetings Act, you have to give notice of the agenda item topic. So in this case, it's request for statutory changes. So at this point, anybody around the table could make a motion that says, we direct staff to work on a bill file regarding X. It's very similar to motions that are made where we get motions, 30 minutes before an agenda item on rules or standards, et cetera. If you were that strict in saying that any motion had to be made public, it would actually curtail your authority and your board work significantly. So this is similar. And in this case, I think as Chair Huntsman mentioned, this doesn't actually do anything other than act to ask staff to go open a bill file, and then the legislature would have to create the bill file, actually act on it. So it's not even implementing something, unlike maybe your motion to approve a rule. That is an act that has legal effect. In this case, it's really just direction to staff.
I was just seeking clarification, so.
Okay,
thank you.
and then also, I'm noticing the head nod, but he's not part of this. A.G. Queenenberry?
Yeah, I agree with what Angie was saying.
Okay.
They just need reasonable specificity.
Okay. Well, I want to state the motion that I'm not seeing any other discussion. The motion before the board, we'll vote on this, to move the board to direct staff to work with the legislature on potential legislation to amend provisions in section 53F-7-203 related to paid professional hours, including to, number one, amend the language to require the educator plan to be submitted within the first 5 days of instruction instead of the first day of instruction. Number two, explicitly allow educators who begin employment with an LEA after the beginning of the school year to submit the educator's plan within 10 days of employment. And number three, allow an LEA to prorate the hours provided to an educator who begins employment with the LEA after the beginning of the school year. That is a motion before the board. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Okay.